Thank you, Lawrence. Our second honored guest at this Legislative and Economic Summit is Deidre Myers. Deidre currently serves as the Director of Policy Research and Economic Analysis at the Oklahoma Department of Commerce. Her team provides economic, demographic, and labor data analysis to state leadership, develops and advises on economic policy formulation, and performs business intelligence for recruitment and expansions. In addition, the division houses the Oklahoma State Data Center, which is the state's leading agency to the U.S. Census Bureau. Previously, she managed state economic and community development programs, directed a national project for the Corporation for National and Community Services, administered the state of Massachusetts AmeriCorps program, and served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon. Deidre completed her undergraduate studies in history, religion, and French at OSU, and her graduate work at OU in economics and public policy. She serves on the board of directors for the Council for Community and Economic Research, Creative Oklahoma, and the Oklahoma Academy. We're fortunate to have her as our guest today. Will we please welcome Deidre Myers?
This is kind of tricky.
It is.
Okay, I've always been told that I have a pretty loud mouth, so I'm afraid that I'm going to kind of... Now, one of the things that economists always enjoy is having a captive audience. So I have to say that I'm quite pleased that this is required for you to sit here to get your hour. But knowing that you had a busy morning and then we had a very nice lunch and you've already listened an hour to some very dense and helpful data, I would suggest that anybody who needs to, please walk back and get more sugar or coffee. It's okay if you're jittery because you've had too much. It'll just, make this very exciting. You may not need the sugar and caffeine, though, because I am going to wow you with charts and data. This stuff is going to be so good that you're going to be just on the edge of your seat. Now, where Lawrence had a very national scope, and particularly in housing, I'm going to concentrate on Oklahoma and Oklahoma's economy, how it's been performing, and what we're looking forward to. The second half of my comments today are actually going to focus on public policy going forward in terms of the economy and economic development. And it relates to some of the comments that Governor Fallin had in her State of the State address on Monday. And I understand that this is a very policy-savvy group, so I hope that the information that we're talking about will help you understand the direction that Governor Fallin is taking economic development, definitely in the next 2 years, possibly beyond that. Before I make any other comments, I do want to say something about the mortgage interest deduction. Now, as a state employee, I'm not allowed to lobby, but I would suggest to all of you that I support any activity you may have on that. That's you go get them. It amazes me when some of the policies that they talk about. It's kind of like cutting off your nose to spite your face. Isn't that the saying that we have from grandparents? So appreciate any words you can do on that. Okay, so going forward, looking at Oklahoma's economy, and it is very interesting. Lawrence's comments on the national scope. I don't know if this is true of everybody, but when there is a lot of talk about DC or the federal government, it's just depressing when you see what's happening. And the fact of the matter is, Oklahoma could not be further from what is happening in DC. Our experience over the past couple of years has been radically different. The attitude of our leaders are very different. And so it is a nice juxtaposition to hear the comments from the global economy and the national economy into what's going on in Oklahoma. Because, quite frankly, the hindrance that we have had in Oklahoma is coming from DC. So that's, we would be growing at an even higher rate and have more expansion if it were not for DC. Is there actually a way to turn this down a little bit? Because I'm hearing a lot of back. Okay. Because I'm going to be off the stage here in just a second if I keep trying to move back. All right. So looking at the measures for Oklahoma's economy, I basically have 4 large measures and then one, which Lawrence alluded to, but is very, very important. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Is employment, unemployment, labor force, and participation. And under participation, I want to look particularly at gender, age, income, and education. Now, this is very applicable to you when thinking about your customers because this is also how you identify your homeowners and purchasing clientele. So that's what we'll be looking at today. The first thing I want to mention is our month-over-month employment for the state of Oklahoma. In this particular chart, you'll see, and I did mention, these charts are fabulous. Okay, so as we look at this particular chart, you will see month-over-month employment gate, and these are net numbers, not percentage. 2 things I want to point out. First, the color of the chart. The blue part of the column is actually manufacturing employment. Now, this is payroll employment. Payroll employment means companies actually report to the OESC on unemployment insurance. Okay? So these are payroll jobs. The red part of the bar is all other employment and all your other kinds of industries. Now, why do I pull out manufacturing and what does this mean? Watching manufacturing is very important on a smaller scale economy because manufacturing has changed tremendously over the past 10 years, particularly after the 2001 recession. Manufacturers have gone through lean process improvement, so they hold far less inventory. That means that they are very reactive to what is going on in the economy. When you're thinking about a business, there are, of course, fixed costs and variable costs. Fixed costs are mostly the real estate, the place where you are. They cannot get rid of that cost in the short term. So if there is some kind of change in the economy, that's a cost that they have to continue through. A variable cost, though, most commonly is associated with labor. And so companies will either hire or fire or let go labor according to what's going on in their business cycle. And so when you see manufacturers hire or fire, it tells you a lot about the immediacy of the economy and what kind of contracts they have coming in for the short term. But it also tells you a little bit about the medium term. Because as we saw coming right after the recession, manufacturers were not hiring full-time employees. They were actually working through temp services to have employees come in and just work in a temporary basis. And so we didn't actually see any big employment hiring except for temporary services. So when I see manufacturing hiring, that's telling me both a short and mid-term psychology of manufacturers. It means that they have product contracts coming in, and they are actually willing to take the risk of hiring, which also includes benefits and other kinds of costs, because they know they have some kind of contract that needs to be filled out. So that says a lot there. The other thing is that our manufacturing has acted very differently than the nation. Our manufacturing has been highly dependent on some of the industries we have, particularly energy. Now, we think of energy in Oklahoma, of course, oil and gas, and you think of Chesapeake and Devon and Sandridge and Anadarko and Williams. But there are a variety of other industries that then support energy. And we are one of the great manufacturing states that produces pumps, valves, and compressors. And so you see this kind of growth in those numbers. Now, the other thing you can see is that in the second half of 2011 and the first half of 2012, all of our numbers are above the line, and we were doing quite well. And then you'll see in the second half of 2012 that we kind of go into this jittery, volatile kind of situation where we can't decide, are we really going to grow? Are we excited? Oh, are we not going to grow? Oh, yes, we're going to grow. No, wait, we might not grow. And that is very much a result of what's going on in DC and the uncertainty that we have in this economy, particularly with our aerospace and defense, because that's another sector in Oklahoma that is very strong and is watching with great interest what is going to be happening with any kind of funding cuts that happen in DC. Now, not only do we have our 5 military installations that employ over 140,000 people, but we also have a supply chain around those installations. People who manufacture goods that are used by the installations or other things. And so you'll see this, you know, the number of businesses that are around Midwest, Del City, in that area, in Enid, in Lawton, in Altus, and then in McAllister. So those are very dependent on the funds that are coming in. So you're going to see this kind of herky-jerky movement there, and I expect that we will probably see that the first half of 2013 as well. The January numbers won't come out until actually March, as will the review of 2012 data, but I expect that the first 3 months, and depending on what Congress does in March, it could go on until June, we're going to have this push-pull effect because people just don't know. Now that also affects very much our investment dollars and what companies are willing to invest. Now let's look at Oklahoma compared to the other states. These are all the states in the bottom, and this is year-over-year growth by states. This is basically for the year of 2012. Employment growth for 2012. Now in these charts, Oklahoma is a blue column. The other states are red, and then the green columns are those states that are contiguous to Oklahoma. Okay? So that kind of gives you an idea. Now, one of the points I want to make here is that 7 states had no employment growth or an employment loss in the past year. I mean, that's quite amazing that we are 3 years out of the recession, and still there are 7 states that had employment losses over the year. Then there are a number of states that have employment losses less than 1%. Which is, I mean, you have to have employment gains above 1% just to be taking in population and other kinds of movement. So when you look at this, Oklahoma is over there to the left. We were 7th, yes. And that's actually a fall, a drop, because of what has happened these past couple of months. Until December, we actually ranked 2nd. And we had been 2nd or 3rd, but 2nd 12 out of the past 18 months, and in the top 3, 17 out of the last 18 months. And so it's just this last month that we kind of dropped down. So, you know, imagine when I'm trying to explain to the governor that we dropped from 2nd to 7th right before her State of the State address. So we didn't use that quote. And I'm like, explain to me, you know, how many governors are there, you know, that are out there that would be like, we were 7th in year over, you know, month over month, year over year growth employment. Woohoo, 7th, that's great. And she's like, oh, sigh. Like, okay, we have gotten a little spoiled in terms of our economic progress over the past year. But you can see that the states that are to the left are states that have some kind of mining or asset orientation, particularly North Dakota. And the North Dakota employment gains have just been ridiculous. And in fact, they are having huge infrastructure problems. Now, when we look at employment growth, we love for that growth rate, the sustainable growth rate for employment, to be between 2.5 and 3% in terms of year-over-year employment growth. That's somewhat similar to what is considered long-term GDP growth of 3%. When you get much higher than 3% for a state, you start having other kinds of infrastructure problems that are similar to what happened in Nevada and is happening now in North Dakota, where you don't have housing, you have shortage in terms of schools, hospitals, and other kinds of infrastructure like roads and sewage and other things like that. So we really want our employment to be at that 2.5 to 3%. We were 2.2 for 2012. So we're doing well, and we would have done much better if it were not for those pressures, those exogenous pressures from DC. Now here's the point that I want to make with year-over-year manufacturing. When we talk about manufacturing, and there is a large misconception that manufacturing has been offshored or outsourced and that we just don't have manufacturing anymore. And that is a fallacy, and that's one that we need to change. It is true that we do not have the same number of people working in manufacturing today that we did in the 1970s. However, we also don't have as many farmers today as we did in the 1880s, and we produce more per farmer than any other country. It's the same with manufacturing. Our productivity level has increased to such a point that we just don't need that many people. And then there is the response that, well, then robotics is taking over, and so we don't need, the robotics are taking over the jobs. Well, the kind of jobs that we have in manufacturing now are much more skilled and much more sophisticated. And so it's people who have to have a post-secondary education. So the kinds of jobs we have in manufacturing, while there may not be as many, have a higher wage and are much more sustainable and long-term. They don't have the same kind of physical requirements on manufacturing people as they did before. Now, I want to point out Oklahoma on this particular, we were 5th, and unfortunately, I had to tell the governor this after we had been #1 in manufacturing for the past 12 months. So, all 2012 going in, we were like number one. And then the data came out, it's like, no, we're number 5. Okay, so the next question was, well, what were we since I started my term? Well, we got up to number 2. So we're number 2 in manufacturing growth since Governor started her term, and in overall employment, we're number 4 since the governor started her term. So that may give you an idea. The other thing I want to point out is that 20 states had no manufacturing growth or a loss. So not quite half of the states have still to have their manufacturing industry to recover. Now, what does this mean for housing? Well, it is a big deal because manufacturing jobs are very stable. It's a very good income, and that means a good clientele base around those communities that are manufacturing oriented. I'm sure that those of you from Tulsa are very aware of what's going on with American Airlines and the need to keep those kinds of jobs in that market, because it does create a lot of stability in that market. Now, we mentioned unemployment rate, and there is a big difference in Oklahoma compared to the rest of the nation. You will see in this particular slide that Oklahoma, we have the unemployment rate for December was 5.1%. The U.S. average has been right around 8, it dips under a little bit, 7.8, 7.9, right in that area. Those states that are in the light yellow are under 5.9. Now, 5% is considered natural employment, okay? Some of you may be familiar with this term. And what that means is that there is equilibrium between the labor supply and the labor demand. So there's kind of an equilibrium between households who are looking for work, people who are looking for work, and firms or businesses that want to hire, okay? When you go actually below 5%, it can be as problematic as if you have a very high unemployment rate. When you have a high unemployment rate, it means that there are people who want jobs that can't find jobs. When you have a very low unemployment rate, you actually have the reverse. You have businesses who want labor but can't get labor. And so this is an important point to remember because there are effects that come with having the low employment rate. As you can see, though, there's still a very large part of the country where there is a higher than what is needed in unemployment rate. Let's look, though, at Oklahoma, because just like in the U.S., how there isn't a homogeneous number for the entire country, in Oklahoma there isn't a homogeneous number throughout, and we don't have the same experience. Now, this is an audience, I'm sure, that can understand not only when it comes to housing, but also when it comes to jobs and employment, it's location, location, location. And you can see when we look at the county unemployment rates of Oklahoma, the western part of the state we have 40 counties, 40 out of our 77, that have an unemployment rate of 5% or less, okay? In the southeast area, you can see we have 4 counties that are above 8, and we have 6 counties above 7. 3 counties above 8 and 6 counties above 7. So just like in the U.S., where there are spots that have really low unemployment and spots that have high, we have the same thing going on in Oklahoma. So what are the effects of the low unemployment to our west? Well, one thing is that companies are forced to hire, or if they can hire, because sometimes they can't hire, right? So if you have a company that wants to hire, maybe they can't put into effect a second shift or a third shift in manufacturing. They're stuck with a limited number of people, or they're hiring people who don't have the skills necessary to perform the function. Now let's be honest. How many of us have worked with someone that you thought probably shouldn't be hired? There were actually some people in here who, seriously, there are some people in here who have never worked with someone that you thought, this job is not a right fit for you. As Mickey Mouse would say, you could find your happy place elsewhere. But this is a situation that we have in the western part of the state. We have a lot of companies that aren't able to hire good fit. Now, what does that mean? That means if there is a company that wants to expand, they may look going someplace else. Or if there's a company that is interested in locating to Oklahoma, they're not going to look in that area because there aren't enough people. The other thing that happens is that there's then a wage pressure. When we're talking about supply and demand, if you're competing, if your labor is competing, then you're going to be able to offer a higher wage. And this is where we can get inflationary pressures. Because if you simply don't have enough people, then you're going to be competing for that labor. The other thing that's going on is how many people are now working in energy in the west part of the state. And those wages are so much higher that we're actually pulling from other businesses, which then make it very, very difficult for them to compete. Now, this is going to come as a huge shock to probably everybody in this room, but there's a housing shortage in the west. This is actually what we hear over and over and over again, is that companies want to expand in the West, but they can't find any place to put their people. And it is the point that was made earlier about community banks, because you don't have large national builders in Enid, Woodward, Sayre, Guymon. However, the housing there is in a desperate shape in terms of the inventory. In fact, there's a colleague who works at Chesapeake that was trying to find someplace in Blaine County, and a 3-bedroom older ranch house that was built in the late 1960s was on the market for $280,000. It sold in 2 days. And I was like, if only my house were in Blaine County, I would sell it like that, but no. So, I mean, this is the situation we have, though, is that we have the ability, we have the assets, and we have the market to want to expand and grow our economy in the West. But one of the things that's hindering that expansion is our housing inventory, and that we can't get people out there. And builders are waiting, and so it's a cycle that isn't going forward. On the flip side, we have a worker shortage in the West. In the Southeast, we actually have a workforce gap. And that means we have people who are looking for work, but they don't have the skills or knowledge that is needed for the particular jobs that are open. And we have certain policies in the state that keep them in the Southeast instead of moving them where there are jobs. So this is one of the things that we have to figure out, is how can we get better mobility, but even if they are moving, where do they go? So that's a situation that's in the state. Now, we see that there's a difference in unemployment from geography, but there's also a big difference in unemployment depending on a cohort. And the cohort is just the fancy name that demographers use to explain what kind of population segment you belong in, whether you're female or male, what age it is, whether you're white, black, Native American, Hispanic, whatever group that is. And what we can see from this particular chart, the red bars are unemployment rates for that cohort that are above 10%. And that's very problematic, very problematic. The blue bars are those cohorts that have unemployment between 5 and 10%. So it's not as problematic, but we still have work to do. Then the green columns are below 5%. So we have the reverse problem that we have a workforce shortage. All right, so let's look at this, and on the left-hand side of this chart, you'll see that it's broken down into white, black, Hispanic, male, and female, with age 16 to 19, and then over 20. And then on the far right, you're going to see the other 4 are by educational attainment. Now, remember that unemployment rates are for those people who are actively searching for a job in the preceding 4 weeks, okay? So that means that you are participating in the labor force. You're actively looking for a job. So this is not all 16 to 19-year-olds in the state. It's only 16 to 19-year-olds who are actively looking for work, whether it's a full-time or part-time position, okay? Now you can see that for every cohort of youth, which is age 16 to 19, the unemployment rate is above 10%, okay? You also see that for black, age 20 and above, we have it's 7.2% for unemployment, okay? Now, the other thing though is when you go to white, Hispanic, or male, it drops to under 5% over a particular age. Now, when you look at this, you would think that there are some real problems in terms of age or gender or race. But then what we look at in Oklahoma, this is not true in all states, but in Oklahoma, when we start looking at the skills a person has, meaning what kind of educational attainment they have. Do they have a high school degree? Do they have less than a high school degree? Do they have a college degree? Do they have an associate's degree, a certificate, or something like that? You can see that the picture becomes very different. And so a less than high school degree, the unemployment rate is above 7%, but when you go to a bachelor's degree or higher, the unemployment rate drops to 2.9%. Now, do you remember what I was talking about, that 5% line? And if you have bachelor's degree and under at 2.9, we have a huge shortage in terms of our educated workforce. But it's not just bachelor's degrees, and that's where there is a misconception in our state, but it's also for associate's degrees or certificates. Those are any kind of professional certification that happens post-secondary that allows you to have a skill or knowledge or ability to be in the current economy. That is the great equalizer in Oklahoma. And if a person has post-secondary education, they are finding a pretty good environment for increasing their prosperity. Now, that relates straight to income, disposable income, and the ability to invest in real estate. So let's talk about labor force growth in terms of people, because people move where there are markets. Now again, Oklahoma is in the blue, and you can see that only half of the states in the U.S. actually had an increase in labor force. Now remember, labor force are people who are looking for work, okay, over the age of 16, and who aren't in an institution like prison or something like that. That's probably important to point out. So it's non-institutionalized civilians over the age of 16. That's what we're talking about here. I want to point out, there's the blue line over there in Oklahoma, over 2% labor force growth in the past year. A couple of points that I want to make here. First, while Oklahoma had the third highest percentage growth, I want to point out that even though Oklahoma has the 27th largest population, we had the 9th ranking in net population growth. I mean, those are huge numbers. We have a lot of people moving into the workforce market here in Oklahoma. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that far green bar on the far left. Can anybody see what market that is? It's actually not a state. Shocking. I think I'll keep my comments about the expansion of the federal government. We'll just move on. So Oklahoma is doing very, very well in terms of drawing more people into our workforce. Now, you have to remember, we were talking about our unemployment rate being one of the lowest and dropping. This is happening at the exact same time that we're actually growing our labor force. Because there are a lot of states, and particularly in the national market, that they're playing with the numbers because the unemployment rate is going down, but that's because they're actually losing labor force or the labor force isn't growing. Our labor force, so when you look at unemployment rates, we have the lowest unemployment rate in the nation for any state that has top quintile labor force growth. So we have two factors going on that are very, very strong. And this is where it goes, where I mentioned the labor force participation rate. So in Oklahoma, male and female, you can see over to the left, as a state, we're at about 68% labor force participation rate now, which is pretty good. But you can see that there are, of course, differences depending on the cohort. One point I want to make out here is white female at 55%. So 55% of white females over the age of 16 are looking for work, 52% of them being employed. This is the second lowest labor force participation rate in the US. Only Utah is lower. And so that shows some of the social mores of Oklahoma, that we are a more conservative state, and we really like one of the parents to stay home and nurture children. The other thing that has happened with this particular labor force participation rate is that as homeschooling has gone up, we have more and more women who are staying home to do homeschooling. So we have seen that because there isn't a great regard in some areas for our public school system, we're actually losing labor force and we're duplicating labor force. So not only do we have teachers in the public school system, but we're pulling out other possible laborers so that they can have homeschooling as well. The other thing I want to point out is the Hispanic male. 88% of Hispanic males participate in the labor force. So this is actually a big part of our labor, particularly in the western part of the state. Now, there's another reason why people don't participate in the labor force, why they may not be looking for jobs, and that's age. Because when we all get to a certain age, some of us older or younger than others, we would prefer not to work. At least that's what my thinking is, that at some point you would like to retire and pull yourself out of the labor force. Now you can see from this map of the state that age is very, very different depending on where you are. And this also affects housing, does it not? Because if you're in a community with a much older establishment, it's pretty likely that they already have their house paid for and they're settled. So you don't have a lot of activity. What you'll notice, though, is that the median age for Oklahoma is 36.2, which is good. It's a little bit below the US average. And a key indicator for median age is 40. When we in economic development look at the growth of a particular area and what kind of activity there's going to be, if the median age is above 40, we automatically start looking someplace else. Because what happens when you have a population with the median age above 40? Now remember, median is midpoint. It's not average. So if you have a median age at 40, that means exactly half of the population is above the age of 40. Being above the age of 40, I will tell you, you're not likely to have children above the age of 40. And so then you start having a declining population scenario, okay? When you have a median age below 40, then you have an increasing population scenario. And so you can see the states that are in, the counties that are in red in this particular map have a median age above 42. So that is really problematic when we're looking at long-term population changes. Now the dark blue counties are those counties that have a median age under 34. And I bet the first thing that comes to mind when you look at those counties is, well, let's see, Payne, Cleveland, Custer, universities, right? And then the other blue, Pontotoc, Cherokee, Tulsa, those regional colleges and universities. And so of course they would have a much younger population. The other thing I want to point out is Texas County. Are any of you from the Guymon area, Panhandle or Guymon area? They actually have the youngest median age in the state. And this is, yes, Panhandle State is in Guymon, but it is very much being driven by the Hispanic population in Guymon City. Guymon City is the first city in Oklahoma to become a minority-majority city. They now have 52% of the population is Hispanic. For the county, for Texas County, it's right under, it's at 46%. So I expect in the next census we will have that flip. As a point, white families have a fertility rate of 1.7. Now that's kind of problematic if you want to increase the white population, because if it's under 2, you're not being very successful. Hispanic families have a fertility rate of 3.4. So you can see when we're talking about economic development and movement of our population that we project that by 2040 Hispanics will comprise over 30% of the state's population. Now, that does mean something in terms of demographics about housing, because what we have found in the Panhandle particularly is that Hispanic families usually have multiple families living in the same home, that they like a larger home with a very large living area, very small bedrooms where they can have a number of generations living together. And so that's actually been a very interesting characteristic of our economic development in the Panhandle and West. So that's something that we're expecting will infiltrate more of the counties in Oklahoma. Median household income. This is another area, and obviously very, very important when you're looking at how households make investments and where they place their equity. Now, household income is all income. It's not just your wages. It could be retirement, it could be capital gains, it could be leases for mineral rights, it could be a number of things that we're talking about. And what we see is that Oklahoma's median household income has risen steadily. It's actually done very well. Particularly in the northwest part where we have commodities did very, very well because of the drought that has happened. The commodities that have been able to be sold off, particularly also cattle, a lot of profit there, but also mineral rights. A lot of people making money on oil and gas. Now, for the CPS data, in 2011, Oklahoma's median household income actually increased by 9%. That's about $4,000. So we definitely are having more disposable income going into the economy for people to be able to use. Now remember, it's median household income. Median is midpoint. And so that midpoint went up $4,000. But here's the other problem, is that we also have an increase in poverty. And this goes to Lawrence's point that we're having actually more diversity in terms of income in our population. So the statewide poverty percentage is 16.2. That's a couple of percentage points higher than the US. It's actually a couple of percentage points lower than Texas, so that's one thing that we beat Texas at. But you'll look that it's also a disparity across counties that we have in the state. And in the southeast, we have much more incidences of poverty or a higher poverty percentage than we do in the northwest. In fact, those counties that are in red have 25%, at least a quarter of the households considered to be in poverty. Whereas if you look at the central, north central, and northwest, that's not the case at all. So while we do have much more income going into our Oklahoma families, we also have a segment of our Oklahoma families that aren't doing well, that are moving backwards. And most of the time, that is related to education and the opportunities that one has with education. For this particular slide, what kind of job is available for someone who does not have a high school degree, or some kind of post-secondary training? And what you'll see in this particular slide is the red part are those people who aren't in the labor force. Now, when we say not in the labor force, they're not even looking for work. They're at home watching Oprah, or at the golf course or the casino. They're doing something but not looking for work. The blue part of these columns, the rows, are people who are employed, and then the green part is that little sliver of people who are unemployed. But that means that they're looking for work, right? We remember that definition. Now look at the change of the labor force participation rate depending on education. So when we look at a bachelor's degree or higher, it's 74.2%. That's almost 7 percentage points higher than the state average. When we look at an associate's degree or certificate, it's about 66%, which is pretty close to the state average. But then when we have a high school diploma, it drops, and then we have a less than high school degree, it drops even further to 43%. Also a higher unemployment rate. So what you see is that we have still, in Oklahoma, even though we've had a tremendous increase in people going into the workforce, and we have a low unemployment rate, and we have jobs that are still open, we have a number of people in those areas with less than a high school degree or a high school degree that aren't looking for work, or are at minimum wage jobs. And so this is a problem for the ability of those households to be able to have disposable income to invest. So here's a breakdown across the state. Because we know for the state, our state average is about 23% of our population has a bachelor's degree or higher. But again, that's not across the state. Those counties that have a dark blue shade are that 25 to 34. And Washington County with Bartlesville is actually the county with the highest bachelor's degree scenario, 34%. But again, those are, when you look at the counties that are in blue, those are counties where we have a university, a community college, or some kind of a regional university. Then those counties that are in the dark peach have 11 to 12% of the population with a bachelor's degree or higher. And so you can see how this really correlates with income and poverty. I think it's becoming quite clear. Less than high school degree, this is the reverse of that side. 14.1% of Oklahomans have less than a high school degree. And up to about 10 years ago, that was very oriented towards people who were over 70. Many of the generation of World War II and before had to drop out of high school for economic reasons, family reasons. And so 3 out of my 4 grandparents were not able to finish high school. Both my granddads were not able to because they were the eldest male. And so they had to go to work on the farm. And so you see in Oklahoma that we have a large segment of our population above now the age of 85 that do not have a high school degree. But they did very, very well for themselves. Each generation after that lowered that percentage without a high school degree. We had generation after generation with escalating educational attainment. Unfortunately, the current generation right now of youth, age 18 to 25, is greater than that above 85. Yes, less than high school. The current generation, 18 to 25, has a percentage of less than high school degree that is the highest of any cohort that we have in Oklahoma.
You saying we have that many dropouts?
Yes. It's close to 17%.
How does that compare to other states
We're in the bottom 5.
as far as?
Right, percentage of dropouts. And this is where you get that, these huge numbers that you have here. Now, there's a little trick in that dropouts in our education system are measured by those people who start their sophomore year. Most of the dropouts in Oklahoma occur in 8th grade and 9th grade. So that gives you a kind of idea of the disparity that is going on in Oklahoma right now. There are a lot of reasons why, I am not, education is not my area of expertise, so I wouldn't want to go into that. But, it is a real social issue. I mean, when you look at the kind of situation that we have, look at the number of counties that have 20 to 25% of the population, and this is above 25 years old, okay? So in the counties in the southeast part of the state, look at the number of counties that above 25 have at least 1 out of 5 people with less than a high school degree. And so now you understand the issue that we have with economic prosperity and opportunity and how it relates to education, how it relates to income, how it relates to the ability to invest and to be able to prosper. So here's what we have going forward. When we look at the jobs that are being created in Oklahoma, which is this top row, these are the jobs that are being created. These are the new jobs in our state. Only 23% need a high school degree. Nearly 50% need an associate's degree or a certificate of some kind, a professional certificate. So you may not have to have a bachelor's degree, but you have to be certified to be able to do something. Another 24% require a bachelor's degree, and not quite 5% require a graduate degree or above, okay? So I like to split this into basically 20, 50, 30. 20 for high school, 50 for an associate's degree or certificate, and 30 for a bachelor's degree or above. All right, that's the jobs that we have. Now let's look at our current educational attainment of Oklahomans. 46% have a high school degree and less. 31% of our current population has an associate's degree or professional certificate. And 23% has a bachelor's degree or higher. So you can see that there are huge gaps that we have in the educational attainment of our citizenry and what kind of jobs we have. Now, doesn't this make sense why people who have a bachelor's degree or higher have an unemployment rate of 2.7%? Makes a lot of sense, because there are a lot of jobs out there and we don't have enough. So this is one of the reasons why we have to think about workforce and education. So that takes me into the second half of the comments, which is really the last third. Let's put third. And that is what's going on and how are we going to keep our economic progress moving forward, because quite frankly, we can't grow more jobs if we don't have the people to be able to put in the jobs, right? And so this is why we need to look at the goals for the governor's economic development strategy. And there are basically 4 goals of this strategy. The first is to be able to prioritize resources. The governor is almost like a CEO, and she wants to know how each agency is spending their money and be able to prioritize that across. The second is to align policies, to know that each agency is actually on the same direction. And I know this is that's just crazy for a governor to expect all of her cabinet secretaries to actually be going the same direction. But we're going to try. We're going to move that way. The third is to maximize outcomes, to make sure that there's an ROI on tax dollars. So for every dollar that is invested by Oklahoma citizens, they're getting back more than $1 in service from the government. And then fourth, require accountability, to make sure that we have goals, that we're trying to meet those goals, and if we haven't, that we do something to change that. So there's a certain methodology that we looked at in terms of economic development, and this is based on Michael Porter's seminal work at Harvard in terms of clusters. And we realize in economies that industries that have the same widget or product kind of cluster together, right? So you have oil companies cluster together, you have other kinds of companies together. Well, it's not just the oil company, it's also the company that manufactures the pump, and it's also the company that has the big rig that moves the natural gas, and it's all those kinds of companies that are around that, and that's considered a cluster. Well, what we wanted to do is to look at Oklahoma's economy in a systematic manner, and to be able to think in terms of much broader, how does it work as a system? And so we identified 3 areas, and that's wealth generation, growth potential, and competitive advantage. Because we don't want to spend taxpayer dollars on trying to grow companies that are already past their peak, right? We want the market to determine that. What are the companies that are growing? Who has a product that is in demand? Also, where do we have a competitive advantage? What are our assets in Oklahoma? We don't want to just compete with Arkansas and Texas. We want to compete with Mexico and Malaysia. And so we want to, look at and really identify our assets and move those forward. So what we did of a process is, and this is anybody in here who's kind of a geeky numbers person, this slide's for you. And just let me explain it, because I spent a lot of hours doing this. But we took all of the industry data in the state of Oklahoma, and we basically took 72 quantitative variables and found each industry that was the best ranking, and not each of the 3 sectors, but all 3. So it was that bullseye in the middle. And then what we did is we put qualitative layers on top of that. So things like R&D, the fact that we have a career tech system, our natural assets. How many of you know that the University of Tulsa has the #1 ranked cybersecurity program in the entire U.S.? Anyone? That's actually a huge benefit for us when we are competing against federal contracts, because that's one of the biggest security problems that we